children, to his business associates, to his neighbors, to his community more generally, all the way up to how the world must be governed according to Allah. And why this is relevant is the way it must be governed according to Allah is with the triumph of Sharia, the supremacy of Islam, specifically those who adhere to Sharia, ruled by a caliph in accordance with Sharia. And that is, as you may know, not a good thing for the Jews. It's also not really a very good thing for just about anybody else, including, by the way, an awful lot of Muslims. Those who don't follow Sharia having been deemed apostates, which is a capital offense. In short, this is our time's totalitarian threat. My old boss, Ronald Reagan, warned that every generation faces an existential threat to freedom from these kinds of ideologies. Some have called this communism with a God, which frankly makes it a lot more dangerous than the old-fashioned kind. Because, after all, it's in our political DNA as Americans, codified in our Constitution, to respect the faiths of others, no matter how crazy they may seem. And the genius of Sharia and of its adherents, most especially the Muslim Brotherhood, which I consider to be a far more serious threat to this country and to Israel and to freedom-loving people everywhere than Al-Qaeda on its worst day. Because the Muslim Brotherhood has figured out that by masquerading as people practicing their faith, they can perpetrate what they call civilization jihad. You may not have heard of that term. If you care to do so, I commend at the very least you take a look at the second appendix to the book in the back. It is a document, and I just have to tell you this story because it's evidence of the hand of Providence, I think. A document that was found in 2004 on an artery not so far from here, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Excuse me, it wasn't found there, but it was found as a result of a traffic stop that was made when an alert Maryland Transportation Authority cop observed a couple driving back and forth across the bridge and noticed that, unlike a lot of tourists, I don't know, this may have been your experience, you get up over the top of that bridge and you look out and it's a magnificent scenery. And people pull out a camera and take a photograph. Well, these folks were taking photographs, all right, except they were taking photographs of the structural supports of the bridge. That then, maybe, I don't know, the fact that the woman doing the photographing was wearing a hijab might have tipped him off, but that would be profiling, and that would be wrong, wouldn't it? In any event, that traffic stop, which led to him running their IDs, which led to him establishing that the driver of the car, a fellow by the name of Ismail Al-Barassa, was wanted on a material witness arrest warrant in connection with fundraising in Chicago for Hamas. Did I mention that it's a designated terrorist group? Yeah. That in turn, thanks be to God, gave rise to a search warrant on their home in a suburb of my town, Washington, D.C. About 20 minutes, if the traffic's not so bad, from the capital, Annandale, Virginia. The FBI went top to bottom in this home and, fortunately, noticed that below the bottom was a secret sub-basement in which they discovered 80 banker boxes worth of documents that made up the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. Now, I wish I could tell you that we knew what were in all of those documents. We don't. In fact, they've been withheld from public scrutiny. This is one of the things that we're working on to try to get them released. Because after all, the Muslim Brotherhood knows what's in them. But a few of the documents were introduced into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terrorism financing trial in U.S. history, down in Dallas, Texas. And in 2008, this particular document got a lot of people's attention. In fact, it was instrumental, I would argue, in the conviction of the 5 people who were brought to justice in the course of that trial. For what? For providing material support to Hamas. This document described, it was basically a strategic plan for the Muslim Brotherhood, dated 1991. And it wasn't meant for our consumption, of course. It was a report back to the mothership in Egypt. You aware that they now run Egypt? Yeah. I thought that might have come to your attention. But this was back in 1991. And in this private correspondence for the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, what did this senior Muslim Brotherhood figure, who was the author, Muhammad Akram, say was the mission of the Muslim Brotherhood in America? Well, it's pretty gripping. He said, quote, "It's a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within, eliminating its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that God's religion is made victorious over all others." Unquote. Now, I don't know about you, but I considered that to be kind of unfriendly. And certainly at odds with the characterization of the Muslim Brotherhood provided to the House Intelligence Committee in February of 2011 by the top intelligence officer in the United States government, Lieutenant General Jim Clapper. Did you remember that? He said the Muslim Brotherhood is, quote, "a largely secular organization that has eschewed violence and has no overarching agenda, at least internationally," unquote. Now, what's really important about that, folks, is not only that it does not compute if you actually know anything about the Muslim Brotherhood. Clue 1, largely secular, not. But the really troubling thing was, it certainly looked, if you go to the videotape, that he was reading from notes. This wasn't some slip of the tongue or gaffe. This was guidance that the top intelligence officer was told, I believe, to give the Congress of the United States in the run-up to the Arab Spring. But not before the Obama administration started trying to help the Muslim Brotherhood come to power, not just in Egypt, but throughout the region. Another important data point about this, which brings us again back home, is attached to that so-called explanatory memorandum, strategic plan, was a very interesting list. Under the heading of a list of our organizations and organizations of our friends, were 29 groups, which even today, 22 years later, many of them still make up the most prominent and important Muslim American organizations in this country. For example, the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, mentioned number 1, the largest of these groups. The Muslim Students Association, Number two, the first of these groups, with some, by different estimates, 300 to 500 chapters around the United States now, and so on down the list. My point is that if you look at that list of Muslim American organizations, first of all, again, I would submit that do not represent all Muslims in this country. And yet, our government considers them to be the legitimate representatives of, spokespeople for, and leaders of the Muslim American community. It is they who are relentlessly courted, accorded access, and used for counsel on administration policy after administration policy. Let me just give you one example. And by the way, there's an enormous amount of additional detail on all of this if you're interested in a course that we produced. It is available for free online. It is a video-based course. The web address is muslimbrotherhoodinamerica.com. 10 parts. One of the folks profiled in that course is a fellow who runs a mosque down in, again, my neck of the woods. It's called the All Dulles Area Muslim Society, or Adams Center, in Sterling, Virginia. The imam's name is Muhammad Majid. That's his day job, and in his spare time he runs the Islamic Society of North America, the one that was listed number 1 on the Muslim Brotherhood's list of our organizations, the largest Muslim Brotherhood front in the United States. And again, speaking of Providence, I just happened, and this is again in the course, I just happened to run across, I guess it was the fall of 2011, a fellow by the name, you may know him, Dan Lederman, from the state of South Dakota. He's a state senator out there, a prominent figure in the Republican Jewish coalition, very good man. And we were talking, and I told him about this course that we were preparing, and I mentioned that one of the folks that we were profiling was Muhammad Majid. And he said, Muhammad Majid? Huh. Said, interestingly, I traveled with Muhammad Majid after appearing with him at an event, I believe it was up in Minnesota, with Keith Ellison. I can tell from the groans you know Keith Ellison, the first Muslim American, first Muslim brother, member of Congress from Minnesota. Well, he said what was striking was, as they were traveling from the venue where they'd been speaking to the airport, Muhammad Majid was getting a steady, I think, series of phone calls, maybe there were text messages or emails, because the President of the United States wanted to see him right away. Well, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, and trust me, I'm not making this up. It was the night before President Obama's second speech to the Muslim world. This one held at the Department of State. The bookend to his speech in Cairo. Mention was made of earlier. Now, I don't know exactly what it was that Muhammad Majid and President Obama discussed on the eve of that speech. But I don't think it is unduly cynical to say maybe they discussed the idea of having the president declare a change in U.S. policy to insist that Israel must return to the 67 borders, which is what he did the next day. Does that seem outlandish? Talking to a Muslim brother committed to the destruction of Israel, seeking his counsel on the speech that was given the next day, adopting American policy to align it more and more and more and more with that of the Muslim Brotherhood? I would suggest to you it's a possibility, at the very least. I'll close with just this one further anecdote, because you are people of action. You wouldn't be involved with this organization if you weren't. This is a moment when we need people to stand up. And I want to just commend to you 5 people who have stood up. And they've been vilified, like Mort, excoriated, like Mort and ZOA, ridiculed, defamed, like you all. They stood up in June of last year and asked 5 inspectors general of the Departments of State, Defense, Justice, Homeland Security, and the office of that aforementioned Office of Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper. To do what? To investigate formally what they had discerned could be a problem. Namely, the fact that people like Mohammed Majid, and, oh, by the way, Homa Abedin, who was then the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, had long-standing associations, all in the public domain, mind you, documented in our course, by the way, to the Muslim Brotherhood. And the question was, could they possibly be having an impact on American policy, with the result of aligning it increasingly with the desires, the ambitions, the demands of the Muslim Brotherhood? Those requests have gone unfulfilled. And I was just told tonight that Michelle Bachmann, who kind of pulled this together with Louis Gohmert, and Trent Franks, and Lynn Westmoreland, and Tom Rooney, was smeared yet again by Anderson Cooper just today. So we need people like you to stand up. Not just, important as this is, with Israel, for their sake and for ours, but also to stand up against the people who are trying to do the same thing here, by their own declared strategic vision and goals, as they intend to do to our friends in Israel. And for that matter, our friends everywhere else. Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, everyone must submit. And I'll leave you with this critical thought. The problem with appeasing them, just as the problem with appeasing Adolf Hitler, only more so, because it's been God telling them how you must respond when the infidel, the unbeliever, the enemy behaves in a manner that we may dress up or rationalize as, oh, I don't know, political correctness or sensitivity or multiculturalism or trying to further the peace process or whatever else you want to call it. Do you know what they call it? Submission, which is, of course, the literal meaning of the word Islam. And according to the doctrine of Sharia, when people see that kind of behavior on the part of the enemy, people imbued with Sharia, following its edicts, what must they do?